Everyone calls Perturabo a whiner, the archetypical Redditor in the body of a demigod, a guy who drank poison hoping someone else would die. And honestly, for the Heresy-era version, that tracks. The Olympia massacre is real. The self-pity is real. The refusal to just talk to anyone about any of it's real. The prosecution has a strong case. But there's a specific moment near the end of the Siege of Terra that almost nobody covers. And it changes everything about how you read what came after. Horus replaced Perturabo as siege commander, swapped him out, benched the man who had been running the most sophisticated military engineering operation in the history of warfare, who had cracked open Lionsgate spaceport and put traitor titans in the Emperor's own elevator system, and handed command to Mortarion, the Death Guard Primarch who, at that point, was fully surrendered to Nurgle and whose primary tactical contribution was making people sick. That happened. It's in John French's novel, Mortis, Book 5 of the Siege of Terra series. And if it sounds familiar, it should, because it's the exact same thing the Emperor did to Perturabo for 10,000 years of the Great Crusade. Perturabo's quote from that same novel is worth reading carefully. "It's over. Horus has given this battle to sorcerers and beasts. The War of Legions is over. Mortarion comes here to take this place. He and what he has become is what this war is now." That's not the voice of someone having a tantrum. That's a man who just watched his employer make the same decision his father made, that the genius doing the actual work is less valuable than the symbol, the plague, the spectacle. He had seen this exact pattern before. This time, he left. So, that's where this ends up. Let's build the case for how we get there. The prosecution's argument goes roughly like this. Perturabo is a petulant, self-pitying Primarch who massacred 5 million of his own people over wounded pride, spent the heresy complaining about not getting enough credit, and then abandoned the most important military operation in human history because someone hurt his feelings. He chose chaos not out of any coherent philosophy, but because resentment needed somewhere to go. The Reddit atheist characterization, a being of immense intelligence who uses that intelligence primarily to explain why nothing is his fault, is the prosecution's headline. The defense concedes significant ground here because intellectual honesty requires it. 5 million Olympians. That is the confirmed death toll from Perturabo's purge of his own homeworld. The rest of the population was enslaved. Some of his own Iron Warriors refused to participate and were killed by their battle brothers. His sister, whose name was Caliphone, confronted him directly during the massacre and told him he was raging like a child because he couldn't accept no compromise, and that he had unleashed horror on their people because of it. His response was to insist the Emperor of Mankind makes no mistakes, not yet blaming the Emperor, just accepting the full weight of what he had done. He stood in silence afterward, watching pyres burn to clean the bodies off the streets. The lore is explicit. Only then did he fully realize what he'd done. So the prosecution is right about Olympia. It happened. It was monstrous. Perturabo's direct orders caused it. The defense doesn't dispute the verdict on that count. What the defense disputes is the analysis of why, because the prosecution version treats the massacre as simple evidence of a defective personality, a man who was always going to end up here. The actual lore sequence tells a different story, not an exculpatory one, but a more complicated one. The Iron Warriors spent the Great Crusade doing the worst work in the galaxy. Siege after siege, garrison world after garrison world, spread so thin across so many systems that they couldn't function as a unified force. While other legions built legends on glorious campaigns, the Iron Warriors built bunkers and held them and received nothing. No accolades, no rotation out. Rogel Dorn was given the honor of fortifying Terra itself, the Emperor's seat, the greatest engineering commission in the Imperium, and Perturabo, who had spent his entire existence being told his purpose was war-making and siegecraft, wasn't even considered. Immediately before the Olympia Rebellion, The Iron Warriors had just completed one of the most psychologically devastating campaigns of the entire Great Crusade, a war against the Herud. The Herud possessed temporal manipulation weapons. Their very presence caused accelerated aging in anything around them. Even Space Marines came out of that campaign psychologically disturbed. The human cost was enormous. The psychological toll is documented as extreme. Then Olympia rebelled. The Below Wood parallel that some commenters have raised, not as official lore, but as analytical framing, is worth considering here. At Below Wood in June 1918, United States Marines fought for 3 weeks of continuous, grinding, attritional combat in conditions that shattered men's minds under what we now understand as extreme cumulative trauma and stress. What contemporary observers described as battlefield madness, we'd now recognize as severe psychological breakdown under sustained atrocity exposure. The point isn't to excuse what followed. Nothing excuses a massacre, but to contextualize the mental state of soldiers pushed past every rational limit, then handed a new catastrophe the moment they stopped fighting the last one. Perturabo wasn't a person who had a tantrum over a slight. He was a being with foundational psychological wounds, specifically an inability to separate recognition of his work from recognition of himself, an inability to trust affection without interpreting it as exploitation, who had just survived one of the worst campaigns in Great Crusade history and immediately encountered proof that the world he'd sacrificed everything for had collapsed in his absence. His sister's words during the massacre confirm he hadn't lost the capacity for shame. The cold silence watching the pyres burn confirms he understood the magnitude of what he'd done. He just couldn't stop it once it started. That doesn't rehabilitate the decision, but it matters for understanding what happened next. Now, the painting. The prosecution makes significant hay out of what it frames as Perturabo smashing a work of art during an artistic dispute with Fulgrim, positioning it as evidence of unhinged volatility, the kind of person who destroys things when he doesn't get enough praise. This is the least accurate part of the prosecution's case, and the highest engagement rebuttal from the audience. A comment pulling 62 likes specifically flagged the omission of the actual scene from the dominant video coverage as the most significant gap in the argument. Here is what actually happens in Graham McNeil's novel, Angel Exterminatus, published July 2013. Perturabo is in his private command bunker. He is working on a miniature mechanical warhound titan, not a painting. A machine, a fiendishly complex lattice of gears, cogs, and timing shafts, assembled with tools no thicker than a human hair. It has a perpetual motion driver. Perturabo had extrapolated a theoretical principle developed by an ancient genius of old Earth and drawn up schematics that he gave to Vulcan, the Salamander's Primarch, to manufacture. The resulting device ticks with what the text describes as a metronomic, precise mechanical heartbeat. Fulgrim arrives. He looks at this thing, this device Perturabo designed from recovered theoretical principles that he had a brother Primarch build because only Vulcan's craft was precise enough to realize it, and dismisses it. Says it's broken, that the perpetual motion driver is losing time. Says, "I have no interest in your toys." Perturabo tells him to listen. Fulgrim leans in close. Then Perturabo slams his brother's face into the machine. The warhound shatters into 1,000 pieces. Bone cracks. In the aftermath, Perturabo reasserts direct command of the expedition, tells Fulgrim he has bitten his tongue and followed his lead, and listened to his stories and allowed him to set the pace long enough, and delivers an ultimatum. Fulgrim cedes control, or Perturabo withdraws the Iron Warriors entirely. Later in the same novel, Perturabo is shown painstakingly repairing the shattered warhound. The text notes explicitly that destroying it had been an act of impulse. He regrets it. Now here's the part the prosecution skips. By the time Fulgrim arrived at that bunker, Perturabo already knew something was deeply wrong with his brother. When Fulgrim's fleet had arrived, Perturabo had perceived the change before they'd even met, the sense that his brother was gone, and something else had taken up residence in the architecture of who Fulgrim used to be. The dismissal of the mechanical warhound wasn't the moment he discovered Fulgrim was possessed. He already knew. What the dismissal did was give him sufficient cause for the confrontation he had been building toward. The prosecution claim is that this scene proves Perturabo is emotionally unstable, lashing out because his project wasn't appreciated. The defense claim is different. This is a being who detected the corruption of a brother Primarch before nearly anyone else recognized what was happening to Fulgrim, who had been carrying that knowledge under pressure through the siege of Hydra Cordatus, and who finally found the trigger that let him stop pretending the thing in front of him was his brother. The fact that he then repaired the Warhound afterward, carefully, with the same tools no thicker than a human hair, is the piece the prosecution absolutely can't account for. A man who destroys things because they don't praise him enough doesn't then grieve the destruction and fix what he broke. What Perturabo does after Fulgrim departs is the tell. He grieves the work. He repairs it. Because the Warhound wasn't about Fulgrim. It was about himself. The pre-heresy friendship between Perturabo and Fulgrim deserves a moment here because it contextualizes both the clockwork confrontation and the stab wound that came later. Theirs was an intellectual relationship, competitive, based on parallel pursuits of perfection through different methods. Where Fulgrim refined artistry toward its most exquisite expression, Perturabo refined engineering toward absolute precision. They weren't close in the way some brothers were close, but they respected each other's obsessive standards. The novel record shows Perturabo was notably uncharacteristically warm around Magnus the Red, another intellectual equal, suggesting that Perturabo's best relationships were with brothers who understood the drive toward mastery for its own sake. By the time of Angel Exterminatus, Fulgrim used a psychic artifact called the Magatar Stone, which Perturabo had previously carried, to drain his brother's life force during their encounter on Idris. The wound Fulgrim inflicted was so severe it was slowly killing Perturabo over time. That becomes relevant to his demonhood. Perturabo didn't ascend to Demon Prince in triumph. He ascended because he was dying from a wound his already possessed former friend had given him, and it was either that or cease to exist. His chaos undivided status was survival, not conversion. Keep that in mind when the prosecution calls it a choice. To understand what Perturabo's plan at Terra was, you have to understand what the other traitor Primarchs contributed to the effort. Perturabo served as primary siege engineer and strategic coordinator for the traitor forces. His role encompassed calculating distances, optimizing artillery placement, timing assaults to achieve simultaneous breakthroughs at minimal cost. This is confirmed in the Siege of Terra novel sequence. His most significant tactical achievement was the capture of Lion's Gate spaceport, which gave the corrupted Titan legions access to the space elevators, putting traitor war machines directly onto Terra's surface and into range of the Imperial Palace. That's documented in The First Wall by Gav Thorpe. His allies were Angron, who by this point had ascended to Demon Prince and couldn't reliably distinguish between traitor and loyalist forces, and who responded to being informed that Mortarion would lead the first assault rather than himself by falling into what the lore describes as incandescent rage and murdering his own warriors. The World Eaters could only be managed by locking Angron away or applying psychic force. Fulgrim, whose Emperor's children spent the siege not coordinating military operations, but pursuing excess, laying waste to Terra's civilian population in ways that consumed forces and attention without advancing territorial goals. Fulgrim found time to taunt Angron, deliberately inflaming the already uncontrollable World Eaters with no strategic purpose. The Thousand Suns were in full mutation spiral by this point, and the Death Guard, Mortarion's Death Guard, were by the siege fully chaos-corrupted Plague Marines, Mortarion's strategic vision warped by demonic influence. Their plague weapons devastated loyalist morale and physical capability, but couldn't breach fortifications or advance territorial control. The community summary that's been circulating, that Perturabo's allies at Terra were high on super cocaine, half dead from space leprosy, randomly turning into balls of feathered tentacles, or too berserker mad to implement any coherent scheme, is colorful, but it's not wrong. Every component of the traitor coalition that Perturabo was trying to coordinate was in advanced stages of chaos degradation that made them militarily unreliable. Horus, watching the siege stall, decided Perturabo had played his part. He disregarded Perturabo's entire siege plan. He decided the operation was taking too long. He handed command to Mortarion. The fandom wiki records Horus's exact decision. Perturabo had played his part and should now cede his command to Mortarion.
One analytical framing that's been applied to Perturabo's strategic decisions, not as official lore, but as accurate characterization of how he operates, holds that Perturabo would sacrifice 1,000,000 lives if that's what victory cost. But if he calculated victory to be impossible, he wouldn't waste a single further soul on the effort. He double-checked the calculations and quit the field. His departure quote confirmed in Mortis, "It's over. Horus has given this battle to sorcerers and beasts. The War of Legions is over. Mortarion comes here to take this place. He and what he has become is what this war is now. There is no victory here. Just creatures and parasites pulling down a dying beast. The Legion War is dead. The chance is gone. The cause is gone." This is the moment the title of this video promises you. And it's important to be precise about what it is and what it isn't. What it is:
a rational calculation, stated explicitly by a being with sufficient emotional and analytical intelligence to recognize the pattern he was trapped in. Horus just did what the Emperor had done for 10,000 years. Used Perturabo as the technical specialist who did the actual work, then discarded him when the tools of war shifted to something rawer and more symbolic. Perturabo saw it, he named it, he left. What it isn't: a sudden moral awakening, a rejection of chaos as a philosophy, a road to Damascus moment where Perturabo realized the error of his ways. His contempt for the chaos gods predated his withdrawal from Terra. It was long-standing, baked into his personality, not triggered by a single event. The lore supports either a reading of genuine self-awareness or pragmatic abandonment of an unwinnable position. The defense argues it was both, simultaneously. But the honest version of this argument doesn't overclaim.
What the defense does claim, specifically,
no other Traitor Primarch at Terra demonstrated that level of clarity. Angron was a demon engine of murder. Fulgrim was deep in excess, taunting brothers for entertainment, pursuing pleasures that had nothing to do with the war he was nominally fighting. Mortarion had surrendered his agency to Nurgle. Perturabo looked at the ruins of his own siege plan, looked at who was being handed his command, named exactly what the situation was, and walked away. After Perturabo's withdrawal, an enraged Horus sent roughly half a Traitor Legion fleet in pursuit of his forces. Think about what that means. Horus was in the middle of the defining battle of the Heresy, assaulting the Imperial Palace, and he diverted significant military assets to chase down the Primarch he had just benched. That's not how you treat someone who had a tantrum. That's how you treat someone whose absence changes your calculations. Without Perturabo's siege engineering, the traitor forces lost their primary source of organized, rational military competence. Mortarion's approach, direct assault with plague warfare, was slower, consumed more resources, and left the traitors exposed to the arrival of Rabute Guilliman's Ultramarines. The transition from Perturabo to Mortarion is confirmed by multiple sources as narratively significant, an authored shift from methodical siege warfare to chaotic attrition. The blog analysis at deathisawhale.com states it plainly. When Perturabo departs, Mortarion takes over the siege, and the transition is meant to show a shift from a siege conducted on rational military principles to something else entirely. That's the case in its strongest form. Horus used Perturabo as the Emperor used Perturabo, as a siege tool to be deployed and discarded. Perturabo recognized the repetition. He was the only one at Terra with the clarity to do so. So where is Perturabo now, 10,000 years later? This is where the prosecution narrative, built entirely around Heresy-era evidence, runs into a wall. Perturabo is a confirmed demon prince of Chaos Undivided. His domain is Medrengard, a fortress world deep in the Eye of Terror that he has spent millennia building and rebuilding, fortifying and extending, a world-sized expression of everything the Iron Cage couldn't destroy in him. His legion continues to prosecute some of the most technically sophisticated sieges in 40K. The Iron Warriors remain, in current canon, the premier siege specialists on either side of the galactic divide. And Perturabo, according to current lore characterizations, is remarkably calm about all of it. The chill AF reading of Demon Prince Perturabo isn't just community wishful thinking. It maps onto confirmed lore characterizations. He despises the Chaos Gods. He views chaos as a weakness. A confirmed source quotes the characterization directly. Perturabo wasn't afraid of using chaos as a weapon or a tool, but the idea of it mastering him was abhorrent. He serves Chaos Undivided nominally, technically, in the structural sense that he exists within their domain. He does not serve it the way Mortarion serves Nurgle, or the way Angron is consumed by Khorne. He holds himself apart, contemptuous. Compare him to his traitor brothers in current canon. Angron is barely distinguishable from a demonic weapon, consciousness subsumed, rage the entirety of his existence. Mortarion is Nurgle's most loyal herald, his identity restructured around his master's embrace. Fulgrim is so deep in Slaaneish's service that the original Fulgrim is effectively gone. Magnus is consumed by the manipulation of fate and time, his decisions increasingly indistinguishable from the great plan of Tzeentch. Perturabo hasn't been consumed. He's still there, still resentful, still architectural, still building things and thinking in structural problems, still contemptuous of the very gods whose mark he carries. Among the confirmed demon primarchs, this is a unique position. Not redeemed, not even close to it, but not gone. The strongest redemption case for any demon primarch isn't Lorgar, who is the ideology, isn't Magnus, who is the instrument, isn't Mortarion, who is the convert. It's Perturabo, who is the prisoner who still knows he's in a cell and hasn't fully stopped thinking about the door. The caveat here is real. Redemption potential is analytical framing, not canon fact. No Black Library author has written Perturabo's return to sanity. His contempt for the Chaos Gods hasn't produced any on-page act of defection. He is a demon prince in the Eye of Terror, and he will be for the foreseeable future. The defense isn't claiming he's about to switch sides. The defense is claiming that of all the options available, he is the only one whose arc has moved in a direction that leaves the question open, where every other Daemon Primarch's arc has closed it. There is one more image worth sitting with. Calophone was Perturabo's sister on Olympia. She was the person who confronted him during the massacre and told him what he was doing. She was also, based on what the lore tells us of his emotional architecture, one of the only people in his life he genuinely loved without suspicion. She died. The lore specifics on how are limited in the available canon, but the loss is confirmed as formative. In the warp, in Medrengard, in whatever passes for Perturabo's private space within the Eye of Terror, there are accounts of him constructing mechanical replicas of his sister, automata, built with the same obsessive precision he applies to everything, and then destroying them, and then building them again. The important caveat: this specific detail, the loop, the building and unbuilding, sits at the lower end of confirmed lore. It doesn't appear in the official sources with the same confidence as, say, the Mortarion replacement or the Angel Exterminatus scenes. It may be interpretive, it may be fanon that has become community orthodoxy. The claim ledger flags it as unverified at the level of explicit canon, but the emotional truth it represents is documented through other evidence. Perturabo built the mechanical warhound and then repaired it after he broke it in Impulse. He gave Vulcan the schematics for a perpetual motion device that served no military purpose. He built it because he could, and because it was beautiful, and because he needed something that would just keep going. He stood in silence watching pyres burn on the world he'd loved and destroyed. And when his sister confronted him in his worst moment, he didn't dismiss her. He watched himself lose her. The grief is in the record. Whether it manifests as a specific loop of construction and destruction in the warp, or in some other form, the architecture of a man who can't forgive himself is visible throughout the entire lore. It was never really about the Emperor. It was never really about Horus. The deepest wound in Perturabo isn't the one Fulgrim gave him on Idris. He isn't a monster who feels nothing. He is a being of tremendous feeling who has turned all of it inward and has no mechanism for release. 10,000 years of that. An eternity of it, technically, given his current status. The prosecution's case, that Perturabo is simply defective, simply self-pitying, simply a man who drank poison hoping someone else would die, misses the thing that makes him genuinely interesting. Self-pity requires the capacity to feel the injustice. The grievance requires believing you deserved better. Both require something the monsters don't have. The strongest argument for Perturabo isn't that he's good. He ordered the deaths of 5 million people. He can't escape that math. The strongest argument is that he's the only one at Terra who recognized what was happening clearly enough to name it and act on it. The only traitor Primarch who demonstrably hasn't been fully consumed by the thing that killed his brothers. And the only one whose story, 10,000 years after the heresy, still hasn't resolved into something final. That's not redemption, but it might be the last necessary condition for it. If you want more lore breakdowns like this one, subscribe. New videos every week.